Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Plugged into Energy Research Lecture Series. My name is Kate Venturini. I'm excited to be here with you all from my home in West Greenwich. I'm joined by some friends and colleagues here on our speaking program, and we're really excited to offer this lecture series to you on behalf of University of Rhode Island Cooperative Extension. This is actually the sixth Plugged into Energy Research lecture series we have hosted, and no fail, every year there are new challenges that we look forward to bringing information to you all about related to energy, and tonight is no exception. And so I just want to orient everyone to the platform here. Thanks to all of you who are joining from home or work. There's a poll up on the screen for those of you who are here now. We'd love it if you would share the role that you play in the energy sector. If there isn't an option there that you identify with, feel free to enter it in the chat and we'll capture that information for our reference. So tonight's program was originally scheduled for October 27th. And if I could see you all, I'd ask you to raise your hand and tell us if you had power that night. Half of us here did not, and so we've rescheduled to tonight, November 3rd. The title of tonight's presentation is It Takes a Village, Advancing Solar Energy in Rhode Island. We have three fabulous speakers here who represent different facets of the energy sector, I would say, from policy to research to the environment. And so we're going to hear different perspectives around the concept of advancing solar energy in Rhode Island. And I'm sure many of you have some understanding of how complicated that is, but I hope you'll all leave tonight feeling like we're in good hands with some brilliant minds working on this issue. And it really is, energy is one of the biggest challenges of our time as we transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. So tonight we'll focus specifically on solar energy. We do have another lecture scheduled for Wednesday, November 17th, which is just 2 weeks from tonight. And we will be highlighting some research and innovation around renewable energy in the grid. So I'll talk more about that in a moment. I'd like to just take a moment and recognize Vineyard Wind. Many of you probably recognize their name. They are a renewable energy developer, specifically offshore wind. They are the this year's Terawatt sponsor of our Energy Literacy Initiative and our Energy Fellows program. And we're able to host this event thanks to their support. So thank you very much to Vineyard Wind. And folks who know me and the work that we do for URI, I always love an opportunity to talk about cooperative extension. There's a lot going on this slide, but what I want to leave you with is that University of Rhode Island is a land grant institution here in Rhode Island, and that means that not only are we charged with teaching students and conducting research, but we're also responsible for making sure that the science that comes out of the land grant university, in our case URI, is available and accessible by the public and folks who aren't at the university. And so our roots kind of began with agriculture and home economics, and as societal economic and environmental issues have become more complex, we've added new areas of focus, we call them, to our portfolio. And so tonight's program falls within our energy efficiency, conservation, and renewables area of focus. And one of the things that these online programs have allowed us to do is really flex some of our commitment to these guiding principles, which is that, you know, we do the work we do in educating around science-based information because we want to improve people's quality of life. and their livelihoods, and also the natural environment. And we also believe in social and environmental justice, and having these programs online, while we're not in person interacting, it's made them a bit more accessible to people. And so we've decided moving forward to do a combination of both to make sure that everyone can participate in these types of programs as long as they have access to the internet. So please spread the word. We're recording this session tonight, and it'll be posted on the University of Rhode Island Cooperative Extension YouTube channel. We'll put that link in the chat or in the Q&A for you to reference. So a few housekeeping items, and then we will get to our program. I would like to direct your attention to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, where you should see either 3 small dots or something that says Q&A. That is where we'd love for you to enter questions for our speakers this evening. Each speaker will have an opportunity to answer your questions directly as they come in after their presentations. So make sure you find your way to the Q&A box. That's where we will collect your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of each presentation. Also, there will be a link to a survey that comes into your email, probably from an email called Messenger at WebEx. So not going to be someone you recognize, but just picture my face, and my request that you complete that survey at the conclusion of this program or in the morning. We will read all of those, and we use those surveys to measure the effectiveness of these programs. And it's really important to us that we collect data. So thank you so much for taking less than 3 minutes to fill that out after the program is over. It'll be in your inbox. And finally, as I mentioned, this session is being recorded. It will be uploaded with closed captioning to our URI Cooperative Extension YouTube channel, where you will also find, thanks to the pandemic, about 60 videos with various content ranging from how to start a garden to grow food for your family, to the electric grid and how ISO operates it, to tick protection. So there's a lot of information. It's all relevant to consumers. We'd love for you to partake and educate yourself in any of those topics. So before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say that we've realized at the university and just in our daily lives that solar energy is proving to be an integral part of the future of our power system in New England. And Rhode Island in particular has mandated some pretty lofty renewable energy goals, specifically for the electric sector. And so as we increase our reliance on solar energy, we have to figure out how to retain our vibrant economy and also conserve our natural environment. And I can tell you in my limited view of this issue that it's a big challenge, but what we hope to do tonight is show you the breadth of what's behind some of the decisions that are being made, what some of the considerations are as we expand solar energy in Rhode Island and beyond. And we have 3 fantastic people to talk to you about that, beginning with my friend and colleague, former colleague here at URI, and now an administrator of grid modernization and systems integration. And she is as smart as that title sounds, Dr. Carrie Gill, who graduated from the University of Rhode Island in 2017 with her PhD from the Department of Environmental and Natural Resource Economics. She also has her Blue MBA from the University of Rhode Island, and through her time, her PhD, studied and worked with Dr. Lang, who is also on the speaking program this evening. So we are one big happy family, really happy to have Carrie here. Without further ado, Dr. Gill, I'm going to switch presenter privileges to you, and you can get us going.
Thanks so much. While I am bringing this up, I want to say I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about how energy is a complex problem. Yes, it is absolutely a complex problem. It is a very multidisciplinary problem that needs a multidisciplinary solution. And so I think it's really great that the speakers here tonight represent three different sectors. I think it's really great to see all the research going on, looking at these different policy objectives and how we balance the trade-offs between meeting our climate and energy goals while also meeting our economic development goals, our conservation goals, and all the other local preferences that we want to see across all 39 of our municipalities in Rhode Island. So couldn't agree more. A little bit about the Office of Energy Resources. We're the state's lead energy policy office, and our mission is to advance a clean, affordable, reliable, and equitable energy future. We firmly see renewable energy as meeting all four of those tenets. In April, Governor McKee signed into law the 2021 Act on Climate. The Act on Climate updates the previous law, the 2014 Resilient Rhode Island Act, to have more stringent and mandatory enforceable greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, eventually getting us to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, our greenhouse gas emissions primarily come from three different sectors. There's the electric sector, which I'll talk more about in the remainder of this presentation. But we can't forget about the transportation sector, which accounts for about a third of our emissions, and our thermal sector. So that's heating, cooling, heat processes, cooking, things like that. And that also accounts for roughly a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. I could talk your ear off on both transportation and thermal. I'm not going to tonight. However, if you're interested in learning more, for transportation, I would point you to the conversations Rhode Island is having with the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI. There's also a lot of work going on to develop a plan to improve access to electric vehicle charging station infrastructure across the state. You can hear more about that at the December 16th meeting of the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council. Happy to share links with everyone on that. For the thermal sector, in 2020, I'll highlight that we produced a technical and economic analysis that looked at pathways to nearly fully decarbonize our thermal sector by 2050. This analysis is very preliminary. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but essentially what we see is that electrification must be a part of the solution, and there's no reason for us to not double down on our electrification efforts now while simultaneously greening our energy supply. The report also shows that because these markets are so nascent and because decarbonizing our thermal sector will be so far reaching, it affects every single building in our state, we can't foreclose the potential pathways of having renewable natural gas and biofuels as options. There's a lot more in that report that's available on our website, energy.ri.gov/HST. I'm happy to talk more about that at a later time. But for now, let's focus on the electric sector. In 2020, former Governor Raimondo issued Executive Order 20-01, which tasked the Office of Energy Resources with conducting an analysis to examine pathways for us to reach 100% renewable electricity by 2030. What does that mean? That means that all of our electricity consumption in state over the course of a year is offset 100% by production from renewable energy systems. Over the course of the year, the Office of Energy Resources worked with other state agencies and stakeholders to come up with a report that rests on four main components. The first is a set of 9 foundational principles related to environment, efficiency, equity, and the economy. And these principles really helped put up guardrails for our analysis and what we would and would not be willing to recommend following that analysis. The technical analysis, I'll go into more detail in future slides, so I'll pause on that here. I'll note throughout the entire year, we accepted stakeholder input. We had 3 public technical working sessions where we shared data, methods, and results. And we had 3 public listening sessions where we invited community members to ask questions, share thoughts, concerns, or ideas about the plan. Report. So all in all, that was really fruitful. We got comments from dozens of organizations, and I think it was over close to 200 individual stakeholders. who submitted comments. So there's just fantastic engagement with this plan. And because of that, that makes our recommendations that much more meaningful because we know that we've heard from stakeholders. The last part of the plan is a set of policy and programmatic recommendations, and I'll cover those in slides in just a couple of minutes. All right, so what do we need to do first to understand what it means to get to 100% renewable electricity by 2030? What we did first was we estimated the amount of electricity that we're going to need based on recent trends in 2030. That's this black line at the top of the graph. We estimated this accounting for things like our really sizable energy efficiency programs, which are actually causing our year-over-year electricity consumption trend to stay about level over the next decade. And that's really impressive. That's even accounting for any electrification coming from heating equipment and also coming from transportation. Now, next, we added up the amount of renewables that we already have either on the books, contracted for through our long-term contracts, or would plausibly come online as a result of our current policies and programs. The bars that you see on this graph represent the level of renewables that we have projected for each year. If you look out to 2030, there's that red arrow that connects the top black line, which is our electricity consumption, with the bar at the bottom, which is the number of renewables that we expect to have on board. That red arrow, that represents the gap that we need to fill with incremental renewable energy resources if we're going to meet the 100% by 2030 goal. That gap is equal to 4,600 gigawatt hours. It's a lot. It's not a lot compared to other states, but it is a lot for Rhode Island. So this is sort of what we need to do. So taking this gap, this 4,600 gigawatt hours, we then explored how we could fill this with different sets of renewable energy resources. One quick thing before I go on any further, our Act on Climate goals, I said that our final goal is to get to net zero by 2050. This study only looks out to 2030. So there's 2 whole decades after we get to 100% that we will continue to need to add renewable energy so that we can cover the additional load that's coming on from heating electrification and from transportation electrification. So once we get to 2030, we're not done. We still have a lot of work to do looking out to 2050. All right, so we're taking that 4,600 gigawatt hour gap. And essentially what we did was we asked the question, if we filled this gap with all of one type of renewable energy technology, how much of that technology would we need? We did this for land-based wind, offshore wind, wholesale solar, which is the larger utility scale solar, and then retail solar. That's kind of like the small scale rooftop solar that you might have over your home or over a business. So this chart presents how much you would need of each different resource. To put this in perspective, if we filled this 4,600 gigawatt hour gap with only offshore wind, we would need 2 to 3 more contracts the same size as Revolution Wind. Okay. If we were to fill this with only rooftop solar, we would need about 10 times more distributed solar than is currently installed. So there's a lot of difference here, but these are sizable numbers. We looked at how much this would cost. The bar chart here presents the net cost, and we've got the same 4 portfolios that we talked about before, land-based wind, offshore wind, wholesale solar, and retail solar. We've added in here a gray bar representing the cost of purchasing RECs. RECs are renewable energy certificates. And it essentially says that we can look outside of Rhode Island to offset, in a very accounting-based way, to offset the consumption that we have in state. RECs are the least expensive of all of these options at $1.4 billion. However, RECs also fail to deliver on economic development benefits in state and a myriad of other issues. And so for that reason alone, based on our guiding principles, we were not considering just purchasing RECs. However, if we look down to the other renewable energy portfolios, you can imagine that if we were to go with 100% offshore wind, we would also get all of the benefits of having economic development at our ports, growing jobs in our state, resolving some, not all, of some of the land use issues and conservation issues that we're facing with some other types of renewables. And so when we're thinking about these policy decisions, there really is this trade-off. Now, I want to pause here. This plan is not a master plan. We stopped short of recommending any one particular technology in any amount whatsoever. We do this for a couple of reasons, but primarily, if we leave this up to the market to decide, then that will result in cost competition, that will reduce our costs, and that will allow the market to decide which technology is the most appropriate to put in and when. And so we're not presenting a centralized plan here. We're not saying pick this technology over this other one. We're saying here are some trade-offs that you can look at, one of which is cost. Now, to put cost into perspective, we also looked at what this cost is equivalent to relative to 2020 residential electricity prices. So again, the colors correspond to REC purchases and then each of the renewable energy costs. What I'll say here, two things. First, any one of these portfolios meeting this goal will cost money. So that is absolutely something that we need to understand, we need to have sympathy for, and we need to optimize, right? We want to minimize the cost that we're spending. What you're not seeing here in these added costs are the costs of inaction. If we don't do anything, if other states or other countries don't do anything to green the grid and to decarbonize, then we're not seeing the cost of negative impacts to tourism, outages, damage from extreme weather and storm events, public health impacts and health bills. So there's a lot going on here. Utility bill cost has to be something that we consider, but it cannot be the only thing that we consider. We also looked at macroeconomic impacts. I'm not going to go into how to read this graph here, but what I'll say is that we're finding that with expected comparative prices in the market for renewable energy credits, we can expect positive benefit for GDP and for jobs for renewable energy projects that are completed in state. That positive benefit declines if the renewable energy credit price decreases. It declines if we're pursuing projects out of state. And it declines if the cost of the electricity is high. So those are three factors that we can think about when we're thinking through our policies and our programs in the future. Now, we didn't just look at the 4 types of technologies all on their own. We also put together 6 different portfolios that balance across things like having a diverse resource mix, having affordability, and adding to economic development. And here you see the same on the left-hand side, the same bar chart that you saw before with the various costs just turned on its side, with the addition of 6 new bars that represent the approximate cost of these 6 mixed portfolios. And so the idea here is that this will give you sort of a range for the estimated cost of achieving 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Again, this is a similar graph looking at impacts to GDP. I'm not going to go into the details here, except that if you look at the mixed portfolios and if you look at in-state development, we're likely to see very positive impacts on our GDP. I'm going to briefly go through our policy recommendations. I recognize that we are at time, so I am going to get through this. I'll just highlight the most important ones. So first, this executive order that tasked us to do this study, it just tasked us with doing the study. This is not a mandate to get to 100% renewable electricity. And so our first and foremost recommendation is that we have to somehow figure out a mechanism where we can track our progress, and that mechanism has to be mandatory and enforceable. A mechanism like the renewable energy standard is one potential solution to doing that, and I'm sure there are others as well. The second thing I'll highlight here is that energy efficiency is critical. Energy efficiency keeps our load down, and that means that the gap that we need to fill is smaller than it would be otherwise. That means that it's less costly, more affordable, and you get all the benefits, all the non-energy benefits of energy efficiency. We have some planning and enabling recommendations. I'll underscore here that one of our recommendations is over the next several years to build out a strategic role for energy storage so that we can more appropriately match the timing of renewable energy production with the timing of when we consume that electricity. And then last, we have a set of equity recommendations. We, in the report, center all of these recommendations within the policy and planning recommendations, but we're calling them out here to give them additional salience. Essentially here, what we really need to do is partner directly with communities to understand what the prioritized outcomes are for those communities. Based on those community-driven outcomes, we can then determine metrics, track those metrics, and improve those outcomes. I'll end by bringing this back to the Act on Climate. We are starting really in earnest to do this work. By next December, we owe an update to the 2016 Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Plan to the administration and the General Assembly, and we're getting started on that this month. We're having our first event. It is a sharing session. This is on November 16th, and it's in the afternoon. Hopefully you can attend over lunch. And essentially, we're going to have a facilitated discussion to see how we scope what this update looks like. In the future, we'll have plenty more. Everything will be posted on our website, climatechange.ri.gov/AOC. With that, I will end. I'm looking forward to questions and to good discussion with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gill. No matter how many times I hear this information, I learn something new every time. So we have a couple questions. My friend Deb in Narragansett is wondering why retail solar is such an expensive option for renewable energy out of all of the options in the mix.
Yeah, that's a great question. So really it comes down to a few factors, right? You can think about one of the biggest drivers being economies of scale. If you're able to find a piece of land where you can build a single project but larger, then you can get some economies of scale from doing so. You get better production in some ways. You can have less labor to do everything. You can buy the parts in bulk, things like that. When you're talking about individual rooftops, one, they're smaller, so you have higher customer acquisition costs. You have to find more roofs to put the projects on. Two, a lot of times the roofs are not at the ideal orientation or slant that they would be otherwise, right? That the solar panels need to be, that they otherwise could be if they were just sited in open space. And so that actually decreases the production. And then also installing on rooftops, sometimes rooftops also need to be updated in order to handle the solar energy systems. So there's really a lot of factors that go into it, but that's kind of the gist. Along those same lines, though, on the flip side, if we think about local economic development and jobs, it takes more people to install rooftop solar than it does to install utility scale solar. So there's sort of two sides of the coin here. Great question.
Yeah, that was a good question. And so kind of along those same lines, my friend Renee in Tiverton is asking if there's something in the plan that encourages developers to add solar rooftop installations or other systems to their housing in terms of siting.
Yeah, another great question. So the really difficult thing here is how do we balance multiple policy objectives and defer authority to municipalities for all of their zoning and siting ordinances. You know, we have to sort of weigh all these things together. And so it's this really complex problem. We touch on this a few ways in the 100% report. So first is a policy recommendation to try to do a little bit more to find the right balance in affordability between retail scale solar, which is primarily rooftops, and wholesale, which would not be rooftops. So if we can do what we can to make retail solar less expensive, then that can help shift the economics and the market dynamics and can therefore encourage more rooftop solar. We can do those things in a few ways, right? There are policies, but also in our programs. That's something that we can try to figure out how to do to provide that shift in incentive. The second way that we touch on it is through our planning and enabling recommendation to explore integrated grid planning. Integrated grid, let me back up. So our poles and wires that make up the electric grid in Rhode Island are planned and invested in a yearly basis. This process is very transparent. It is all done and filed for review and approval and oversight with the Public Utilities Commission. And so we sort of have this very clear process about how to invest in our poles and wires. One thing that we could explore is to take a longer term look at how we want to use our electric grid and change the way that we make investments to potentially see some cost savings and to potentially have a way to nudge development into preferred sites. And so that's something that we're in the very preliminary stages of exploring. I could probably go on for a while. I'm going to pause there. But that's a great question. And it's like the $1 million question.
It is, and I think it's a good lead into Dr. Lang, but I'm not going to do that yet because I want to ask you one more.
Okay.
So this is also a good question, a gold star question. What will our state's next steps be if our renewable energy goals are not met within the time limits that are set in the rules?
Yeah, good question. So the one binding rule that we have right now is our Act on Climate. We have to get to net zero by 2050. There are provisions in the Act on Climate that discuss enforceability and what is enforceable when and by whom. So I would refer you specifically to those sections. Our renewable energy standard at this point only requires us to get to, I believe, 38.5% renewable electricity by 2035. It has not been updated. So that's one potential mechanism that could be updated to enforce the 100% renewable electricity goal. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. I think it does. I mean, I think one thing that I've noticed about the Office of Energy Resources website, which you are here representing, Carrie, is that it's been updated significantly and it's fairly easy to find the reports that have been written, and they have really nice graphic design. So as a communicator, you know, that is important because it's not necessarily something folks are going to pick up to read for fun. But if any of you do want to dig into any of this information or, you know, tangential information that's generated out of the Office of Energy Resources, it's there for you. We'll put the link in the chat, and we'd encourage you to take advantage of the transparent process that this is all funneled through.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. And if I could just say one more thing.
Sure.
We are 100% committed to pursuing this. We're trying to do everything there is that we can do at this point to move forward while balancing all of these different policy trade-offs and policy objectives. So we are very interested in hearing directly from you, from anyone, about how we can be better coordinated, about what else we can do, about your preferences for our programs and policies. Please feel free to reach out anytime. Happy to sit down with anyone and tell you about the resources. And I hope I see everyone at the November 16th sharing session for the Act on Climate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Gill.
Thanks, Kate.
Great to see you. Next up, we have Dr. Corey Lang. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. So My colleague, Dr. Lang, is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental and Natural Resource Economics, and Corey's research focuses on non-market valuation and energy economics. He has published some studies on offshore and onshore wind energy, and it's been really exciting to add solar to the mix in his research portfolio. I'm going to give you sharing privileges, Corey. I was hoping this would happen a lot faster, but so many windows open. So just in this space, some of you who take advantage of our lectures may recognize Dr. Lang from a few of the Learn at Home lectures that we offered in 2020 and 2021. This presentation that's coming up is part of a project that we've been engaging people in for about 2 years now, almost. And so we're excited to bring you this information now. And Dr. Lang, here is your presenting privileges.
All right, it showed up. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Here's my screen. So Carrie, I think, did a great job, and it's fun to follow her. So she talked really big picture, and I'm going to talk very small picture, right? What's going on the ground in Rhode Island as solar energy, utility scale solar and energy has really ramped up, and we're seeking to meet these goals, but there's some hiccups along the way. And so a few years ago, I got interested in this topic. I find it fascinating, and I'm going to present some of the research that I've been doing over those years. So we have these renewable energy goals, and that leads to incentives, and the solar developers have seen those incentives and met the demand, and have been developing a lot of solar arrays in Rhode Island. Now, solar arrays can be sited in many places, right? Some of the places that they're sited are on forested land, and those forests are clear cut, and solar is put up. Sometimes it's put on farmland. Sometimes it's a small system on a farmland and the farm is still in operation. Sometimes it's a large operation and the farm is kind of no longer. But they can also be sited on landfills or commercial rooftops, parking lot canopies, but those tend to be very expensive, versus the forests and farmlands is where it's very cheap, okay? But it's very contentious, right? So if you attend zoning board meetings, most anywhere in Rhode Island, but particularly some of the western towns of the state, this is very contentious, and people are really concerned about their town changing its character and the loss of ecosystem services, the loss of views that come from the clear cutting and the conversion of farms. And so, yes, we want solar, but a lot of people are concerned about where it's being sited. Slides aren't advancing. There we go. So just to get some visuals, this is a giant solar array in Rhode Island that used to be a forest. Right? Here used to be a working farm. Now it's a big solar array. This used to be a landfill. It was capped and solar is put on top. That's Rose Hill. And here's an image of a carport canopy. This is not Rhode Island, but it gives you a sense of what these can look like. So we have all these different siting options, right? And what we want to understand is resident preferences, right? And so Carrie talked about utility bill costs, right? So there are all these different renewable options and they have different impacts on utility bills. Well, there's other costs that are not market-based costs. They don't impact a utility bill, but they do affect people's well-being and their enjoyment of an area. And some of these siting decisions can impact that. And so what we wanted to understand through this research is those costs. what we call non-market costs, right? There's not really money exchange hands, but people do have welfare effects. And so if we can understand those resident preferences, we can also advocate for those resident preferences to be incorporated in deciding decisions. These are, the resident preferences are often excluded or minimized because they're not a central part of the transaction, right? The central part is the landowner, the developer, and the zoning board or the town council, right? Those are the parties at the table making a decision. But there are other people impacted by that decision that are outside of the transaction. And so we want to bring in those voices. But I do want to be clear, the objective of this research is not pro-solar or anti-solar, or pro-developer or anti-developer. We're not trying to take a side. We're just trying to bring all the voices to the table through serious economic research. So what did we do? We did a couple studies. The one I'm going to talk about tonight was a survey we did of Rhode Island residents. And the design of the survey had 4 basic parts. In the beginning, we gave some introduction, some background information. We talked about how this was a consequential survey because we were going to share the results in forums like this, as well as directly to policymakers. We got some basic information on energy attitudes. And then the core part of the survey was what's called a choice experiment. And here's where we present respondents with hypothetical scenarios of possible solar developments. And people, would look at the different attributes of a possible solar development and decide whether they would like it or not. That's essentially it. The hard part comes is there's trade-offs, right? There are things they like and things they don't like about each of these possible arrays. And so they have to make trade-offs. And through those trade-offs, we're able to estimate value for each of the different attributes. So the attributes that we put in, the key one was really prior land use, right? So we had development sites on farmland, on forest land, on commercial land, and on brownfields. Then we also varied the size of the array, whether the array was visible, if there was a setback from the property line. And we also took into account probability of residential development, because if a forest, a 100-acre parcel of forest land, if it's not developed into solar, it could be developed into houses. And so that's an important component, important realistic component that we wanted to put into our model. And then we also modeled cost. And this, while these plans do not directly impact costs, this is a way for people to internalize their values, like the value of certain developments and what they're willing to pay for certain developments to happen. Okay, and then we ended with some demographic questions. We did 6 focus groups held fall 2019 through winter 2020. We distributed the survey to a random sample of 3,000 Rhode Island residents, both electronic. We did an electronic survey as well as a mail survey. We had a 24% response rate, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is right on par with recent academic studies. That's pretty typical. What did we find? Well, the basic energy attitudes reflect what we all think. So solar is the most popular of all energy sources. Okay, so it has a favorability rating of 85+%. It's offshore wind and onshore wind are also popular, but slightly less so. What's not popular? Coal, nuclear, and these things make sense. But this is a good starting point, because a lot of what you hear in these town meetings is, well, we like solar, but, and then it goes on. And so we find that most Rhode Island residents are in favor of solar. However, when it gets to these attributes, we find that people are willing to pay substantial amounts of money to avoid or encourage that type of development. Okay, so what we have here is the willingness to pay numbers. And for a fully visible array, the negative numbers mean it's like a negative impact, a damage. They suffer a welfare loss. And so for a fully visible array, the average willingness to pay is like $6 to $8 per month per household. And so people really dislike visible solar arrays. Now look at forested land. This is the most disliked attribute. $40 to $50 people are willing to pay to avoid that development. Or spoken another way, that's the compensation needed for a solar array to be developed on forest land. Farmland is also disliked, but people are willing to pay positive amounts of money for solar to be developed on commercial or brownfield land, right? So we get this strong bifurcation of where people like solar to be sited and some real money that they're willing to pay. So how do we create policy that incorporates these preferences? Well, there are some models out there for incentives and disincentives that we can look to. So already in Rhode Island, there's a pilot project for a 6 cent per kilowatt hour adder for a parking lot canopy. Other states do similar, but other states also go further. So specifically Massachusetts has their smart solar program where they offer adders, so additional incentives for developments on brownfields, covered landfills, and disincentives for developments on forested land. Okay, so they're driving a wedge between the incentives based on the types of land where solar is developed. And so some questions we could ask is, do these existing policies pass the benefit cost test? And then how do we translate our estimates into policy relevant numbers? Can we do something similar to think about adders or subtractors to the existing incentives to encourage the types of development that are consistent with resident preferences? So that's the exercise we go through here. We think about people's willingness to pay for a given policy action, like moving a development from forest to commercial, from forest to brownfield. And the numbers in the first column are household willingness to pay. But we can also think about, household willingness to pay total. Well, how much would they pay per kilowatt hour, right? So that's column 2. And then we think about aggregating households within a given distance band, and we get some numbers that really make sense, right? So a 7 cent per kilowatt hour adder would be justified if it moved development from forest to commercial, right? That's in the same ballpark as Massachusetts, the smart solar policy, okay? And so we see these as really valuable, that these are the wedges. If we look at column 3, what people are willing to pay, or what neighborhoods, regions are willing to pay per kilowatt hour for these different policy actions. Okay. So conclusions, people have positive willingness to pay for brownfield commercial lands, and farmers forest land, it's a negative. They require compensation for that. In terms of attributes, they like large installations. I didn't cover that here, but they do have positive willingness to pay the larger the installation is, and that backs up the idea that people like solar, but they dislike completely visible installations. So moving forward, we can think about these incentives, right? Could we enact a wedge that drives, differentiates the incentives? We're thinking about differential incentives for these different land types. And so we could think about a wedge from forest to non-greenfield of 7 cents. And that's backed up by our analysis. From farm to non-greenfield types, the commercial, the brownfield, the covered landfill, 3 cents. Visibility, if it can just be invisible, that's worth 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Okay. So path forward. How does this happen? It doesn't happen through me. It has to happen through the Rhode Island legislature, right? They have to enact a bill that sets these differential incentives. Okay, so if you all are interested in this, contact your legislatures, because more study is needed, right? These are not final numbers, but I think this is enough to go on that we could think seriously about implementing it. Okay. Kate, how much time do I have left?
5 more minutes if you'd like it.
Sweet. Okay. Plenty of time. I'm talking fast. So that's my proposal. And I think it's worth, with any proposal, it's good to listen to criticisms and think through those criticisms. And so we held a meeting several months ago that these two individuals, Todd Bianco from PUC and Chris Kearns from OER, attended, as well as many other people. And they raised several concerns and criticisms about this idea. They were supportive that, yes, people have these non-market values, that they really do like forest land, they really like solar developments on brownfields, covered landfills, all that. But they had issue with the idea of a differential subsidy. Okay, and so I have about 6 concerns and criticisms they raised, and I was just going to go through them one by one, and hopefully that bolsters our confidence that this is a good idea. So one concern is that the subsidies, differential subsidies, will raise consumer rates, right? We don't want to unnecessarily raise consumer electricity prices. But the issue is, this is not an adder, it's a differential, right? So we can decrease the feed-in tariff for forest and increase it for brownfields and carports. And because it's driving a wedge there, not just adding additional benefits, the cost to consumers could be neutral. It could even be a decrease depending on how it's structured, but it's definitely not guaranteed to be an increase. One concern is that, well, we could enact this and it still won't make a difference, right? The forests is so profitable to be developing forests right now that they're still going to be developed into solar. Well, think about an extreme case that the feed-in tariff is 0 cents, right? That would certainly stop development of forested lands into solar. And so at some point, obviously it can't be 0, but there comes a point where it becomes less profitable and the profitability of brownfields, covered landfills increases substantially, right? Will it stop all solar development on forest? Probably not. But I think, there's this happy medium where the profits are reduced such that developers consider other options and are incentivized towards other options. But it doesn't have to go so low as 0. It could be that state action is not required, right? This is a state level policy to enact these differential incentives. And, one thought is that state action is not really required. This is a municipal issue. Municipal action alone can solve the issue. For instance, increasing allowable coverage on compromised sites. So some areas only allow 20% solar coverage on compromised sites. Yes, certainly that would help, right? But even towns who have enacted larger coverages are still facing development pressures on forested land, right? So I don't think this is the end-all be-all, because again, it's so profitable to be developing forested land. And the meeting that we had with municipal planners is they want state action, right? They want state guidance, they want some help. And I think this is one way for the state to help them. Another thought is that we can just satisfy goals with RECs, right? So this is something Carrie touched on, renewable energy certificates. And okay, we can, but her words were that there are no economic benefits. And my thought is, I want to be part of the solution. I want Rhode Island to actually be generating renewable energy, not just buying it from Quebec or whoever. All right. This one is an interesting one. Electricity markets shouldn't enter into the land market. And if we create these differential incentives, we will be affecting development probabilities in different areas. I think this is a good point, but solar is land intensive. And so electricity is already in the land market, right? If we're going to incentivize solar development, it's in the land market. And so we agree that forests are highly valued. More could be done to conserve, and maybe that needs to take different action, right? Other than just these differential incentives. We could do that too, right? More green economy bonds for land conservation, forest and farm conservation. But I think this doesn't just preclude action in the electricity market. The last one, differential subsidies lead to public benefits, which shouldn't be financed through individual electricity charges. I mean, this was said, I just disagree with it because I think utility customers are already paying surcharges for renewable energy. I don't think this is any different. We're already paying for some public benefits. And this is something that Rhode Islanders can get behind, this type of citing a solution. So I don't know, maybe, well, I don't know. I'll leave that for more discussion, but I think that doesn't. Anyway, I know I'm out of time. I think I ended on time. But thank you so much for listening, and that's my contact if you want to be in touch.
Thank you so much, Corey. It was, I again learned something new every time I hear that presentation. This is all so relevant on a time and topic scale here, and we have some friends in the virtual room who are, I think this is lots of food for thought. We have a comment from our old friend Paul in the chat about the carport canopy adder. I think it's more of a comment than a question. And folks, I'm not sure if folks can see it, so I'm going to read it. Paul said the carport canopy solar policy has not been successful in Rhode Island because the program must be renewed each year, and the development cycle for canopy projects is 12 to 24 months. So from his perspective as a developer, he's unwilling to put development money at risk when the program could be canceled during the development cycle. Also, there's issues with the amount of the adder because of the cost of steel and the fact that it's risen by 200%. So sounds like from the developer perspective, the carport adder could use some updates. I'm wondering if any of our panelists have any comments to Paul's point, and I would also encourage folks in the audience to send their questions along for Dr. Lang. Any comments from our panelists on Paul's carport comment? I think one thing that this comment from Paul kind of makes come to the top of my mind is that there was a question in the Q&A about who the stakeholders have been for these processes, policy processes, and Dr. Gill said, you know, everyone from environmental advocates to developers to the people in the utility sector, to community organizations. And while we all want the same thing, you know, energy security and a clean environment, we all do have different goals. And so part of the challenge in the policy arena, and I'm going to let Dr. Gill chime in here, I think, is that, you know, we're trying to appease everyone while also achieving the goals that benefit everyone. And you can imagine that that's not an easy thing to do. And so I think that these types of conversations are very important because they kind of nudge us a little further along where we'd like to be, maybe. Carrie, do you want to add anything here?
I just wanted to add, we hear you, Paul. It's definitely something that we've heard from other vendors too, not just within renewable energy programs, but within energy efficiency programs and our other electric transportation programs. Being able to signal certainty into the marketplace is extremely vital for developers to move forward. And that means longer planning horizons, longer program horizons, transparency about remaining funding, all things of that nature. We hear your comment, and you know, I would encourage you to voice that comment in other forums as well. But yeah, we definitely want to do what we can and within the constraints that we have to improve our programs to give that certainty to the market. So thank you for the comment.
So speaking of those other forums, I did put a couple links in the chat for folks who are here. One is a link to register for that November 16th session that Dr. Gill mentioned from 12 to 1:30. It's a Tuesday around lunchtime, public sharing session. That's an opportunity to raise your voice. And then also I'll put in the chat a link to the report that Carrie was referencing in her talk. I'm going to keep an eye out for any questions for Dr. Lang, but in the meantime, if his presentation gets you thinking and you want to learn more about the research that he's been doing and how we're making it accessible to different stakeholder groups, including the public, you can visit our project website, which is there linked. You'll see the link valuing siting options for commercial scale solar. So these are very complicated issues. Not seeing any questions at the moment. I'm going to keep us moving. But again, folks, we're here to answer your questions. So if you have any for Dr. Lang, do send them along and I will passively assign them to him in the background. So I would love to introduce my colleague Priscilla De La Cruz, who is now the Senior Director of Government Affairs for the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, and she is also the President of the Environment Council of Rhode Island. Priscilla was formerly at what I know as People's Power and Light, but the Green Energy Consumer Alliance. She was there for 12 years. You may recognize her name from there, but she's now at Audubon. She earned her Master of Liberal Arts with a concentration in management and sustainability and innovation from the Harvard University Extension School, and her BS in business marketing from Rhode Island College. So without further ado, Priscilla, I'm going to give presenter privileges to you.
Thank you. All right, I will give this a try. Looks like I don't have sharing permission yet.
One sec. So many screens. Here we go. Right.
Okay, perfect. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like you're seeing my PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay, great. And I was trying to work the technology and I almost lost my PowerPoint presentation, but I'm glad I did not. I'm sure I could have spoken to you all about solar siting and our climate and renewable energy priorities at Audubon without the slides, but visuals always help. So I am glad I did not lose my PowerPoint. All right, so thank you so much for that introduction. It's really great to follow Carrie and Corey. I really think we're very fortunate to have minds like both of them in Rhode Island and doing the kind of work that they do. So I will get into my part of the presentation. So this is just an overview. I'll cover Audubon Society of Rhode Island's mission. I'll talk a little bit about the climate crisis, also provide an overview of our legislative priorities. I'll talk about the 2021 Act on Climate, and I know Carrie already has talked about the Act on Climate, but I'll cover it from the perspective of an environmental advocacy organization and the environmental community. Then I'll get into solar siting resources and talk about protecting resilient forests, and also talk about considerations for implementing the various policy solutions we have in progress. All right, so the mission of Audubon Society of Rhode Island is to protect birds, other wildlife, and their habitats through conservation, education, advocacy, and that is for the benefit of people and all living things. Audubon follows very closely the science and also the migratory patterns of birds. When we're looking at migratory birds, it's really clear that the biggest threat to birds, wildlife, and also to humankind, as we know, is the climate crisis. So really centering that in our strategic direction for the advocacy that we do. which is really driving the advocacy work that we're doing, and also the work that we do around conservation and education to protect wildlife. All right, so getting into the latest climate crisis news. And actually, I can't see my notes, but I just remembered something that I did want to highlight in terms of the work of Audubon that I think it's really going to center our perspective as we get into the discussion around solar siting, is that Audubon has about 17,000 supporters, and that includes members of the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. And our staff manage about 10,000 acres of protected land. So we are the second largest conservation landowner in the state. So when thinking about addressing the challenge of solar siting, that is, of course, one of our top priorities. So looking at the latest climate crisis, and also considering that right at this moment, throughout this week, our world leaders are convening at COP26, and that also includes some Rhode Islanders, some Rhode Island champions. We actually have Senator Don Oyer in Rhode Island representing our state, and also talking about the landmark legislation that was passed, being the Act on Climate, and also, of course, climate champion U.S. Senator Shelton Whitehouse. And when thinking about, what the challenge is, it's a big challenge when we look at the latest IPCC report. We know that the crisis is intensifying. We are seeing those effects very often, and if we do not make reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that are consistent and at large scale, those impacts that we're seeing with intense rainfall, flooding, urban heat islands, changes to our oceans, that will continue to get worse. When I look at the science and I look at the news, I do like to focus or sort of refocus myself in optimism. We know we can face the challenge. We know we have the solutions to ensure that the ocean state is resilient in the face of the climate crisis, ensuring not only that we are investing in climate resiliency practices to protect ourselves from those climate change impacts that are irreversible, but we can also invest in climate action. And I love that Carrie mentioned that there is a cost to inaction. That is something that I remind myself of constantly as an advocate for climate and environment, that we must act. And we know that we can be a leader in Rhode Island as we work towards addressing the climate crisis. So I just wanted to present an overview of Audubon Society of Rhode Island's 2021 legislative priorities. And of course, we're covering various legislative proposals, from climate to protecting the health of our pollinators, protecting wildlife, and ensuring that we are advancing our clean energy goals to meet the Act on Climate. But I wanted to present this bigger picture to then also point out the bills that I've bolded, or the legislative proposals that I've bolded, as what I see as relevant to this discussion around advancing solar solutions, and also addressing that tension between siting solar and protecting our critical and resilient forests. So I will touch upon the 2021 Act on Climate, which, yay, that has passed. The bill was signed into law in April of this year. I will also dive in deeper into the Forest Conservation Act. I feel like it's very relevant to this conversation. And then I will get into talking about the ongoing advocacy for solar siting. I am pointing out that there was a bill introduced last year to address this loophole with 10 megawatt projects. So what we were seeing, that there was this co-location happening of a 10 megawatt solar project, and then across the road there was another 10 megawatt project, and that was resulting in more clear cutting of forests. So that was an initial step proposal that was introduced last year, and we're very grateful that legislators are interested in that. And I will talk about later in the presentation how now we want to build on that initial proposal to push for something more comprehensive to really address solar siting through legislation. And then lastly, I've also bolded, I won't get into 100% renewable energy standard by 2030. Carrie has talked about that extensively, but I will point out, as she did, that there is nothing requiring the state to actually get to 100% renewable energy standard. So we have to pass that piece of legislation, and that has been a priority of the environmental community. And from Audubon's perspective, it is one of those pieces of legislation that will be needed to meet the 2021 Act on Climate goals, including the Team Community Act that would enable the Transportation and Climate Initiative, known as TCI, that Carrie referenced. We do have to address our emissions in the transportation sector in order to meet the Act on Climate. So diving into the Act on Climate, so the landmark piece of legislation, as we have referenced throughout the program tonight, how do we get to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we do that with interim targets across the board, which Carrie walked us through earlier. So that is, how do we get to the 45% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030, then 80% by 2040, then finally getting to net zero by 2050. And really the importance of not only having targets that are up to par with science, science-based and science-driven, is that they're also mandatory, in addition to being economy-wide, and really holding the government accountable in a very transparent way for how we will get there. So there will be a stakeholder process, as Carrie has mentioned, and one of the first milestones is updating the 2016 greenhouse gas reductions plan and creating that 2022 plan. And then after that, we will see strategic implementation plans develop every 5 years, and I believe the start date of that is 2025. Don't directly quote me on that, since I don't have my notes in front of me. But really, what we're looking at with the Act on Climate, which I like to point out is a very progressive piece of legislation, is that it's also calling for the centering of environmental justice and frontline communities in that planning process when we're looking at how we update that 2016 plan, getting to a new 2022 plan, but also every 5 years, how we're planning to address the climate crisis. And in addition to environmental justice communities being centered in that stakeholder process, also the labor community, and considering our frontline workers and really working towards a just transition. So wanted to first provide that context in terms of the significance of the Act on Climate. Of course, when considering the Act on Climate, we also have to consider what is that balancing act to deploy more renewable energy. Let's see, I think I left presenter mode here. Apologies for that. All right, so I also just wanted to quickly talk about the momentum to act on climate, which I'm also seeing as the momentum to address the challenges that will come with trying to successfully implement the Act on Climate and ensuring that we are really integrating approaches across every level that have a climate lens, right? That this is not in silo that we're looking at these climate solutions, but across the board, this is about our economy, about our state, and how we go about enacting policy solutions that really center climate as well as equity in our decision making. So I'm very proud that about the momentum that led to the passage of the Act on Climate when looking at the Environment Council of Rhode Island, the umbrella organization for about 60 nonprofits in the state. That includes members like the Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, Save the Bay, Green Energy Consumers Alliance, you name it, really led the charge in working with Audubon Conservation Law Foundation, and of course, the policy champions at the State House to build this momentum around acting on climate. The Environment Council of Rhode Island is one of the coalitions that was working on the passage of the Act on Climate, but also newly formed the Climate Jobs Rhode Island Coalition that was mentioned that I am a co-chair of. So really looking at this partnership with labor to address these challenges that we face that also include now solar siting as well. And have always included that, but now the state is mandated to look at how we integrate these policy decisions to meet our target reductions. And part of that is working together across the board, across different coalitions and with partners. I will say Audubon is thrilled that we've had the key partnership of the Nature Conservancy and also Green Energy Consumers Alliance, formerly known as People's Power and Light, and also the land conservation and members of the land conservation community to now figure out how do we work together on the heels of passing the Act on Climate to address this challenge of protecting our forests while also deploying the renewable energy that we need to transition off fossil fuels. And how am I doing on time? I've lost track of the...
You have about 10 minutes, 9 or 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Plenty of time. So I wanted to pivot now to talk about the Forest Conservation Act, which was a top priority of Audubon and also part of the legislative agenda of the Environment Council of Rhode Island. I mentioned earlier that it successfully passed. So what the Forest Conservation Act does is require the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management to establish a commission that will look at the ways to encourage forest conservation, and that's as a means to sequester carbon and mitigate climate change. So really ensuring that we're being mindful of the essential benefits that our forests provide to our environment, to our well-being, to wildlife, and also to our economy. And how do we promote those forest values, but also how do we identify potential funding and the incentives that are necessary to preserve private forest land. So I won't go through the list here, but this is some of the criteria that this soon to be formed commission by DEM will be looking at, as I mentioned, looking at incentives to encourage forest landowners to maintain and manage their land is one that I will point out. And when looking at this Forest Conservation Commission, I think we're looking for the recommendations that fit across this list that will help us address this challenge of solar siting and also of preserving and protecting our forests and really getting to that balancing act. I will mention that there is another commission that was formed by Speaker Chikarchi, which is our Land Use Commission. So that is also another commission that we're looking at for how we look at our land use interests, including affordable housing, but also forest land conservation. So here, I just want to now point out resources that we also have to look at solar siting. So actually, this is a study that was led by the Office of Energy Resources and I believe Synapse Economics, looking at the solar opportunities in the state, solar siting opportunities in the state. So I won't get into details in the map, but this is just to show that that report does look at what is the technical feasibility of rooftop solar when we think about the megawatt capacity there, when we look at landfills, when we look at brownfields, carports, gravel pits, and so on. So really looking at technically what can be built in those preferred areas, but really understanding also their limitations. And as Corey mentioned earlier, it is more expensive to build in landfills, to build in brownfields, in gravel pits, right? There's considerations like site remediation and certain construction costs that build to the cost of those projects. So it also becomes about how do we flip the economics to ensure that it's what the status quo is now does not continue, which is that it is cheaper to clear cut forests, as Corey mentioned, and to build on farmland. So how do we flip that? And how do we really look closely at what is driving the clear cutting of forests. And I will say that I agree with Corey that this is not just a challenge municipality by municipality. This is a state challenge. There are renewable energy policies at the state level that are driving this challenge of siting. So we need state policy to really get us to that balancing act of how much renewable energy, in particular solar, do we need? What are the preferred areas to develop that solar? And how do we flip the economics, the incentive economics, to ensure that we are not building on preferred sites that are critical for habitat, for wildlife, but also for carbon sequestration. So I just also wanted to point out another resource that we have when considering the value of forests. So this was led by DEM, the Department of Environmental Management, this Value of Rhode Island Forest report. And actually Friends in the Land Conservation community reminded me to take a look at this report and pointed out that when looking at forests, that it's well beyond 50% that's on private land. We're talking 68%. And that's why commissions like the Forest Conservation Commission that are going to look closely at this challenge are very critical, right? Because how do we deal with this challenge when we have our forests in the hands of private landowners, which is great, driving economic development there, but it's 68%. So that's a challenge. And again, something that calls for leadership at the state level and really ensuring that we have those economic drivers and that we are talking about the value of forests. And then there was another statistic that I wanted to point out, and forgive me if I get this wrong off the top of my head, but it was interesting when reading again through this report, because it talked about how we often refer to our state as the ocean state, right? It is the ocean state, but it also, more than 50% of the land area that we have in Rhode Island is forest land. So that really stood out to me when thinking about this challenge that we face. And then to the right, I think this is a useful map, just looking at the types of forests that we have, from the green being conservation land, the gray urban, more urban forestry, and then looking at smaller forest land. But of course, in its aggregate, we know that there's a significant portion of there that's owned by private landowners. All right, so I'm almost getting here to my closing. So I wanted to just sort of recap some of the policy levers or planning that we've mentioned, because I think that these are all critical areas to talk about solar siting, to talk about forest conservation, and really figure out how do we get at this challenge, right? We've referenced the Act on Climate Implementation work and the planning that will take that is a part of that process. We've also referenced 100% renewable energy standard by 2030. But one of the things in working with my advocacy peers that we've learned is that 100% renewable energy standard is not the biggest driver for where these projects are, for the clear cutting of forests that's happening. So we have to look at our renewable energy programs. We have many of them. And as Carrie mentioned, it's very complex when looking at the energy infrastructure, but we really have to look at the infrastructure of these programs, right? When we're talking about the Renewable Energy Growth Program or virtual net metering, and just really figure out how can we enhance those programs to ensure that the development of renewable energy is happening in preferred siting areas. But also, what tools do we have to improve, our GIS mapping and really figure out how do we define our core forests and our critical forests when trying to achieve this balancing act. And then I'll also mention, I had on here the list of transportation, and I think Carrie put it very well earlier, that if we're going to meet our Act on Climate goals, it's not just thinking about, the electricity sector. We have to think about the other sectors, and transportation accounts for about like 36% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And we want to electrify that sector. At least I see it as a sector that does need to be electrified in addition to heating in order to really transition off fossil fuels and meet our Act on Climate goal. So that means we really have to, ask the question of how much more renewable energy will Rhode Island need beyond 2030? As we work to decarbonize our economy and electrify these other sectors. And also questions of, what is that balance to ratepayer costs as we're trying to solve this challenge, this solar siting challenge, and what potential funding is there out there that can help us lessen that ratepayer cost or help us to have sites, prepare sites that need like site remediation to prepare them for solar. And sorry, I am in need of more caffeine or dinner at this point, but what I'm getting at is that there is money out there, right? We're talking about federal dollars coming into the state, the American Rescue Plan program. Those dollars are here, figuring out how can we best work with policymakers to point out the areas that need investment when thinking about investing in climate. We know there's a cost to inaction if we don't address the climate crisis. So when thinking about a problem in this magnitude, we do need investments in clean energy, and we also need investments to help us address the solar siting challenge. And there are pending dollars that might be coming into our state from the infrastructure bill that Congress is considering. And next year, our state will be looking at a 22 green bond, which we could usually look at for funding for conservation, parks, municipal resiliency, and so on. So I wanted to point out all of these things, and again, reiterate that these things don't happen in silo. We really need to make sure that there is an integrated approach as we are pursuing all of these policy solutions. And there I am, I had time.
Fantastic. I'm really glad that we ended with you, Priscilla, of great energy. And I think, the work that the Audubon Society and you and your colleagues do is a really important counterpoint for a lot of different reasons. But in terms of energy, I think this really is the challenge of our time. We have to figure out how to power our homes and preserve the areas that we're not going to get any more of. And so I would love to end on a question that came in from Claudia for you, and I would just add on another part to it. Claudia asked, how can college students work towards meeting Rhode Island's climate goal? I would add on to that, what can people do to get involved if they want to raise their voice, in the advocacy sphere for the environment? I think we've mentioned how folks can get involved in the policy process, but can you talk a little bit about how people might get involved with Audubon or other organizations you're familiar with through ECRI?
That is one of my favorite questions. There are many ways to get involved. If you're interested, I will say in particular when it comes to advocacy at Audubon, feel free to reach out to me. As it was mentioned earlier, I am new to my role and new in leading the advocacy department. But one of the things that I do want to work on over the next 6 months or so is adding more capacity to our team and offering internships. And then I will go on to say, in terms of the environmental community, through the Environment Council of Rhode Island, we formed the Climate Crisis Campaign to really call for immediate action around climate, and also to work together towards this transition of fossil fuels and protecting, our beautiful Rhode Island. So there are ways to get involved with that campaign. Often we offer sort of civic engagement trainings and climate advocacy trainings. And we also, right now, for example, we have We're writing letters to the editors around climate, and that is like a statewide approach. So if you're interested in volunteering for the climate crisis campaign, I believe it's riclimatecrisis.org, or again, you can reach out to me. Also the Environment Council of Rhode Island, we have monthly meetings. We also break out into subgroups, various committees, and anyone and all are welcome to those meetings. We could certainly use the fresh and energetic and academic perspective from students in those settings, so absolutely welcome that. And I will say, for going back to Audubon, we do have a volunteer contact form, so you can always go through that and let us know what you're interested in, working on, what skill sets you have, and we can, identify opportunities through that lens. So yep, reach out to Audubon, reach out to the Environment Council of Rhode Island, and get involved with our climate crisis campaign. I'm pretty sure that going into the next legislative session in January, there'll be many more projects and also calls to action that we'll be deploying through that campaign.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. And so everyone who's here and everyone who's watching this recording afterwards, you have some homework. I would say consider joining an environmental organization in Rhode Island, perhaps Audubon, because they're here being represented. I'm a member myself. I think also signing up for the Cooperative Extension newsletter, which you will be signed up for by virtue of your participation here tonight. As Carrie mentioned, participating in the public listening session on November 16th from 12 to 1:30. Our speakers have all graciously provided their contact information to you. So if you're watching this later or here with us live, you're welcome to reach out to folks. You're also welcome to reach out to me. My email is kate@uri.edu, really easy to remember. But on behalf of all of us at Cooperative Extension at the University of Rhode Island, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It means a lot to us to have so many people participating. To Dr. Gill, Dr. Lang, and Priscilla, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise around this topic. To all the Energy Fellows, past and present in the audience, we see you. Thanks for being here, everyone. Take good care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time, November 17th at 6 o'clock for our next lecture on innovation. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone.